At the time, in good old '99, this show was something people's dads were into. It's a show about a dad, after all. And now a younger audience has become fans of it, which is great. Check out my BoJack video for more in-depth talk about intended audience. What was interesting about the intended audience, especially for The Sopranos, is that whereas the mafia trope was invested in by mostly men, The Sopranos brought in something that these guys had never heard of before: female viewership. It's not that women don't get Goodfellas, it's that The Sopranos didn't treat women as an accessory to the men involved. Even the women Tony cheats on his wife with have substance and some personality. Carmela isn't just a face for a nagging wife, and her character's troubles aren't there just to motivate Tony's story. The depth of the characters, coupled with the introspection of family life, was what set The Sopranos apart, not just in terms of mafia stories, but soap operas and other family-based television shows. This is the first time I'll say it, and it will be discussed. The Sopranos is a feminist show. The Sopranos and BoJack share similar intros. Both intros also work as outros because of the similar pacing. Whereas in BoJack's intro, we're watching him go through a typical day. In The Sopranos intro, we're watching Tony's commute back home. The intro song, Woke Up This Morning by British band Alabama 3, has become immortalized as one of the best theme songs of all time. What's very interesting about this song is that it was inspired by the Sarah Thornton case in 1996, where Thornton had stabbed her husband to death after being abused for 2 years. The song is about a woman who's had enough and gets a gun. The song itself is a mode of foreshadowing. Even though it sounds really cool, it describes a lot of tension that can only be ended through physical means. Although The Sopranos is a show that utilizes emotions and thought as story drivers as opposed to purely mere situations and incidents, Tony can't afford to sit in his head all day fantasizing. He's able to do that sometimes, but over time he has to accept that his dreams and fantasies start to relate to his problems in real life. And in real life, thoughts and prayers don't accomplish anything. Actions do. Through his actions and thoughts, Tony walks a fine line between saving his soul and psyche and maintaining his criminally philanderous life. Everything he does, every place Tony goes, is to secure and protect both his families, mafioso and blood. He would kill or die to protect them. And his struggle is to be able to show that love without compromising who he believes he is, and separately, who he believes a man should be. There's a saying that some people die young but get buried old, which in this instance means that if you decide who you are too early and stick to that script, you miss out on a life that was actually yours, and once you're buried, you can't change that. The Sopranos sequel, Many Saints of Newark, documents this timeline in Tony's life and shows us the turning point in his life where he committed to being a gangster. This intro theme plays during the credits of that movie. The first scene of the entire series is in Dr. Melfi's waiting room. Tony is framed between the legs of a statue of a nude woman, which he doesn't look at with interest, but rather looks at it as if it's someone giving him a judging look. He's kind of curious, but kind of a little bit disgusted. The spread legs form a triangle of which he is at the bottom of, essentially framed in. My interpretation is that I see it as a pyramid that he is at the bottom of, and it alludes to the value of women in his eyes. At the top of that pyramid is literally a woman's private part. Even though Tony is a crime boss, he's still what society sees as an average man. He cheats on his wife. The idea of sex to him is more alluring than the reality of it. People see sex in one of two ways. It's either something you want with someone you care about, or as something that is not personal whatsoever. Tony is someone who falls into the latter category, and when men like that enter into committed relationships like he has with Carmela, who doesn't feel she shares the same ideology, they end up giving mixed signals to that person. They'll say I love you and even think they mean it, but the way they love does not end up making that person feel loved. That person ends up having to do all the mental work to convince themselves that this person really loves them. The non-committed person may even stop sleeping with their significant other entirely, not because they're totally uninterested or bored, but because they feel ashamed for hurting that person, whether they acknowledge that or not. Later in this episode, Tony tells Carmela that he is seeing a therapist, and her expectation was that he was going to reveal to her another affair. Tony is actually actively cheating on her, but in her mind, all the things that he does that she doesn't like can be fixed with therapy or church. When someone loves you, they truly only see the best in you, even when you're at your worst. But they're still not in your head, and the only way they know is if you communicate with them truthfully. In relationships that are immature, people will be so desperate to keep the other person around that they can know you'll cheat on them, but as long as they don't see it or hear about it, they're fine. It's not that Tony never wanted to be married. He's simply not committed to anything. He's not very committed to his family or even the mafia in the way that he thinks. He's going through the motions he was taught as he was growing up. He thinks this is what men do, this is what I do, when something comes up that challenges those thoughts. He himself is so fearful of losing tangible things that make up his life that he will get defensively violent, like a dog snapping at your hand for going near the food bowl. So our first introduction to Tony is not as a criminal or mob boss, but as a man who's at the bottom of his own pyramid, looking up at a woman whose nudity is not a welcome gift to him, but part of the judgment he feels from other women specifically, which we will see comes directly from his mother. People in general are judgmental. That's a survival tactic people inherently have, and it's not bad to use judgment. However, the problem we'll discuss is when someone is using their judgment to cause trouble and strife in someone else's life who wouldn't deserve that treatment otherwise. How a mother treats their child sets up almost every expectation that child will have in their life. The same thing if the kid also has a father. Until we find our own voice, we are merely reacting to things in ways our parents, or whomever was the most consistently vocal person in our life, would. In some ways, we are our parents. But generally, it's safe to say that unless our parents did their own mental work and committed to being better for us, their children, we suffer from that greatly, and it becomes our responsibility. Otherwise, we just become the worst sides of ourselves, the worst sides of the people who showed us their worst side. Melfi invites him in, and Tony shows how uncomfortable he is to be in this situation. It takes him a while to sit down, and although that doesn't always mean discomfort for someone, Tony is not the person he usually is in the presence of Melfi. He is not open or ready to talk about things, and is only there on the recommendation of his physician. Melfi breaks the ice, which is important for her to do as the therapist. It is her job to make Tony feel comfortable and to let him know this is a safe space for him to speak. I think some people are scared of therapy because they think they'll have to spill everything all at once or talk about their issues in a certain way that they're not familiar or comfortable with, but the reality is that the therapist responds to you. It's not a bad thing that Tony is nervous. It's very common and almost expected. There is nothing you can do wrong in a therapist's office, except obviously anything to harm yourself or the therapist. The therapist is there to observe you, listen, and see where they can help. Melfi is very observant and has already responded to Tony in an appropriate way, which opens him up and plants a seed of trust. Just the way Tony describes what led up to him having to come see Dr. Melfi is in itself showing major character traits. If Tony didn't collapse in front of everyone as he did and was by himself, he would not have taken it upon himself to see a doctor. He is not realistic about how he sees himself and how he interprets the messages his body gives him. The true folly of man is thinking you know better than what anyone else says. It's like if someone was diagnosed with cancer and told you about it, but they said, "They told me I have cancer," instead of saying, "I have cancer." It shifts blame, because when insecure people are told there's anything wrong with them mentally or physically, they go straight to denial. But in this case, Tony can't tell Carmela, "I didn't have a panic attack, the rest of you did." Being secure and realistic would make Tony a different person. He would not be ashamed to seek help. He's confident enough to know that he has a real risk in going to therapy because if his mafia family found out, then they would see him as a liability. But is realistic to know not to say too much or imply anything about his line of work. In real life, a lot of men do not seek therapy for this exact reason. If their families think there is something wrong with them, they are no longer reliable, no longer useful. Finding a balance between being openly honest with people and working out your own feelings is essential to experience true happiness. You can't be well-rounded lying to people all the time, and you can't be stable if you're passing emotional responsibility onto others all the time. If someone really loves you, they will be happy to hear that you're helping yourself. Tony doesn't want to rely on others to fix his problems, yet doesn't know how to fix them himself and doesn't have anyone coming to him to tell him, so now in his life he needs to seek it personally. I feel like people get all in their feelings about not being able to discover things like Magellan did, but I also feel like there's substance in being an emotional pioneer, discovering new ways to think and feel that nobody has bothered trying to do because they're so lost in, too comfortable with, or simply unaware of the cycles they perpetuate. Tony's first time at the therapist's office is very typical of many people's first experiences. Even people who are comfortable talking about their feelings, people who put independent thought into themselves in that way, talk the way Tony talks about his thoughts. He says, "I don't know," but then goes on to answer the question. That's verbally, physically processing your internal thought process out loud. Sometimes we say, I don't know, when we know exactly, but are afraid the words we have to describe it just aren't enough. It is a lot of work to become in tune and open about emotions when we have been consistently taught that they are too taboo to even think about. Just like in BoJack, we are introduced to these other main characters through flashback and stories. Todd and BoJack were the first characters we meet in the moment. In The Sopranos, Tony and Dr. Melfi are the people we see in the moment, whereas Tony's family is effectively introduced as a time in his life before this. Although Tony starts off nervously, the first things he really has to say are deep. They even ring true to this day and help introduce my overarching point about society's view of masculinity. Although Tony is more successful than his father was, he feels as if this success is just a sign of the times. His father was not detached from life in the way that Tony feels, and as Melfi agrees, most Americans feel this way. Tony has his people, but the reality is that as Americans have felt more and more independent, they mistakenly think that codependence is almost unnatural. Codependence is completely natural and okay. Humans need interaction and touch as a way to regulate ourselves. People really sit around and think that they don't need anyone else, not now that they have what they need. Individuality is a beautiful thing, but deluding yourself into thinking that you are the only individual is simply neurotic and avoidant. Tony is stuck in this somewhat spoiled nature that many Americans have found themselves in. If it doesn't come to you, it's not worth seeking out. Before the distractions made their ways so easily to us, people had to go out. What we have now is the gift of choice. We can choose who to interact with, where to work, many things, but it wasn't something we inherited. Tony would probably find it hard to join the mafia if he was not born into it, if he wanted to join at all. People only dislike nepotism when it doesn't benefit them personally, but the reality is that you will slowly die over time if no one is there to support you. The money you think you make is not yours, nor did you make it. So while Tony is placated in the moment by seeking cheap thrills and watching his bank account grow, he does not have the same inherent happiness he sees his father having. Tony doesn't want anyone else to support him. He wants to maintain what he thinks is his individuality. But again, the reality is that there's a difference between an individual and a loner. A loner causes problems and doesn't like dealing with the fallout. An individual handles themselves. A loner is actually more codependent than a child is because they can't keep anything going for themselves and they don't treat people in a way that makes others want to help. An individual has respect. Again, the key to this is balance. It really doesn't mean that his father was actually happier or that he had more. It doesn't mean that we're missing something as a whole. It means that more than likely, Tony's father held the same feelings, since Tony is struggling with them now. What we may feel like we're missing is actually right there in front of us, but requires you to do your part in making it work. That's why I personally see any team-based event, such as sports or a concert, as something worth a lot, because it is actually very difficult to get a group of people together who are willing to work to make something happen. So Tony finds himself stressed out perpetually, having thoughts and questions he can't find answers to until meeting Dr. Melfi. When the Ducks come to him, nobody in his family really understands why Tony cares so much. As we find out, not only are the Ducks representative of Tony's family, but they are the first neutrally good thing that happens to him in what we can only assume is years. The Ducks do represent Tony's family, and on a larger scale represents Tony's inner child, his innocence. The Ducks also represent Tony's affairs, as Tony sees the women he cheats with as more or less neutral objects that come and go but provide a safe and non-judgmental zone for him. Tony probably felt the same way when his children were born. They were neutrally good or positive things that came into his life. As they grew up, Tony became more distanced from them. He loves his family dearly, but at this point in his life, he needs to grow up. He can't sit at the poker table anymore waiting for the best hand to be dealt to him. He's not only afraid of his family leaving him and moving on, but he is afraid that he will never feel simple joy again. He doesn't realize that he has more power in his life than he knows, that by breaking out of the cycle he is in will alleviate all the fears that he has. That becomes essentially what The Sopranos is about, a person realizing more about themselves than they would have ever known, breaking the cycle, and dealing with what comes of that. In Tony's flashback, we're joining him and taking a second to think about others. The flashback switches perspectives as Tony gets into the pool with the Ducks, because obviously, we as the viewers can see what's going on inside the house, but Tony can't. This is where Carmela's perspective starts, since she is the commanding voice in the dialogue exchange. Carmela doesn't like their daughter Meadow's friend Hunter, As Tony describes, Carmela says she's a bad influence, but he doesn't see how. Carmela does, however, and Tony's a good husband for giving her credit without trying to say Carmela is crazy or doesn't know what she's talking about. And immediately we can see that Hunter and Meadow's eating habits revolve around the 90s, 2000s idea of anorexic chic, only having cranberry juice for breakfast, cranberry juice in itself being an anorexic drink of choice. It comes off as mutual between them, but we can see later on in the episode that Hunter is the one pushing that idea onto Meadow when she says at the barbecue, "I'm not going to eat anything, are you?" Carmela and anyone who has been through that level of weight watching knows exactly what that means. Meadow presumably had no problem eating before meeting Hunter. Girls pushing each other into anorexia was a huge problem then and still is now, although not as spoken about. It's not being hidden or anything. I truly believe people think that saying something once is enough even though it should be repeated a few times. When Hunter asks Carmela how she stays so skinny, Carmela misses an opportunity to teach the girls a better perspective or motivate healthy habits, and instead implies that Tony stressing her out is what keeps her skinny. And in a way, that's definitely true because Carmela worries often. But it's also not the truth because people's bodies are just what they are. If some people are considered big-boned, there are definitely people with bird bones. That doesn't make Carmela a bad person or anything, but she shows herself to be similar to Tony in the way of individualism. Instead of doing what she needs to do in the moment, she's distracted by Tony giving attention to the ducks. This can be read as jealousy in the same way that she's jealous of Tony's extramarital affairs. As his wife, she wants to be the recipient of his attention and time. During her marriage, she has settled for what she's been given on the hope that someday it'll get better. When one partner isn't giving the appropriate attention and time to the other will start to feel bad anytime attention is given to something else. When it crosses the line, such as Tony has with his cheating, Carmela absolutely feels cast to the side. A reason she hangs on to him is because her codependence on him makes up a huge part of her identity. If Carmela had her own money, then it would feel like more of a comfortable choice to stay or leave. What's true is that Carmela is intelligent, but is not respected in the way that she should be. This used to be mainly a woman's issue, but because of the abuse of individuality, disrespect is now completely common and even expected. People feel extremely useless because they are not listened to, taken seriously, or respected. It is Tony's choice to respect Carmela, Tony's choice to seek his own happiness. He does not know the power he holds, and instead abuses the power he feels in the moment. He does not seek his own power outside of cheap thrills in the moment. This again comes from him not being able to trust his own judgment. So he reacts to any advice or judgment in a rejecting way. He doesn't want to feel bad, so he ignores what's best for him. An individual doesn't mind feeling bad or going through negative emotions because an individual will know it is either out of their control or they'll know that they can figure out what to do. A loner is selfish and will think that anything that makes them feel negatively or even think twice is toxic and will either ignore it or lash out. Carmela further shows her dislike of Hunter. She doesn't want her daughter falling for things that seem cool since Carmela is very aware of the risks that come with that. She wants Meadow to be independent, not simply financially or moralistically, but to be a leader and not a follower. There are a lot of things mothers want to say to their daughters that feel too big to put into words. Carmela is not as direct with her daughter as she thinks she is because to Meadow, her mom just comes off as being mean and controlling. Unlike Tony's mom, Carmela sincerely wants the best for people she loves. I find Carmela's dedication respectable. She knows what's important, she isn't going to let people's immature reactions sway her opinion, and she knows it's her job to remind people of what's important. She reminds Tony to be present for his son's birthday, which some people would see as being nagging. The people who can't tell pointless nagging from important reminders and guidance will have a lot of trouble noticing how lost they really are. Tony cuts himself off before he feels like he has revealed too much with Dr. Melfi, and she directs him to continue with the rest of what happened before he collapsed. Tony begins talking about going to work with Christopher, his mafia nephew. Christopher's father was Tony's friend and mentor who passed away. Tony is reading the same encyclopedia about birds that he was reading while talking to Carmela. This interaction between Christopher and Tony speaks directly on the subject of modern masculinity. Tony says that Chris is an example of what he was talking about before. Chris is making personal excuses for why he couldn't make a simple phone call, but just spoiled himself with a $60,000 vehicle. Tony would definitely be one of those people saying nobody wants to work anymore, and I feel that sentiment comes from people who have literally spent their lives working back-breaking hours for a system that essentially tells us to go screw ourselves. That's something most of us read or hear about, but many more people have actually lived that horror. That's how we hear about it. They know what the consequences are, and that's why the older generation worries about the younger generation, even if they may be bad at expressing it correctly. Christopher isn't someone who is suffering through the same same circumstances we in 2022 are now. He was too drunk and tired the night before and hung over the next morning to complete his task, not desperately applying for multiple jobs just to never hear back or have his time wasted for interviews. I know people who have partied until an hour before clocking in to a 6 a.m. shift and then working 12 hours. Chris just knows that he can get away with putting things off. He doesn't know consequences the same way Tony and his father did. Chris is almost exactly like Tony, born into the mafia and perhaps would have chosen a different life for himself if he knew any better. Subconsciously, Christopher knows the same thing that Tony does. He feels like he was born near the end of things. And to be honest, that's a narcissistic mindset. Chris and Tony don't understand that the end doesn't mean things are finished, it means things are changing. Roll with the punches or get knocked out. They're both people who sit around waiting for things to come to them. They never solve their own problems without resorting to violence and have never seen a problem with how they live. So when something they don't like or don't understand rolls around, they have the equivalent of a tantrum. People like that are only motivated when something bad is happening because they weren't paying attention or were thinking about what could happen before embarking. This is why Chris feels so casual in telling Tony that he was thinking about selling his story to Hollywood like Henry Hill for Goodfellas towards the end of the episode. He's not thinking at all about the consequences that could befall Tony and the rest of the family. This understandably offends Tony. He's not trying to stifle Chris, he's trying to protect everyone else that Chris isn't thinking about. It shows a lack of integrity. Chris has no loyalty. He's non-committed in the same way that Tony is, although Tony is more committed to work simply because he knows nobody is going to take care of him if he decides not to do his job. Chris doesn't have the same abusive mother that Tony does. Essentially, what Christopher represents is two things: nepotism and childishness. He's benefited so much off of other people's work that he doesn't see the need for himself to pitch in. Things are already taken care of, so he finds something else to do. He doesn't understand that it's a very real possibility that all the good parts of life that he enjoys can come to a very real end if he is too selfish. The trick is, he's allowed to be, so he thinks that's okay. He has a lot of entitlement, which would offend him if you told him that. The fact he would feel the need to argue that point kind of proves he's entitled. Again, the things he takes for granted in life can come to a very real, very swift end. To these types of people, including Tony and Chris, they see a problem they can't immediately get rid of and their life collapses. They start saying what's the point and making excuses because they don't feel good. So when Tony and Chris see the guy that owes them money, Melfi, in the park, they run him down and attack him. They think they're being men. Chris ends up being more concerned with the state of the car than getting the money, which shows that he's not thinking about the fact they need money to fix it. He's not concerned about losing the money, that it'll put him in a bad spot. He's annoyed that the money will have to be spent. Tony's not only angry about the loan dodging, but he reveals that Melfi has been telling other people exactly what Tony is insecure about, that Tony isn't as effective as the men who came before him. That was my analysis of the first 10 minutes of the Sopranos pilot. Like and subscribe and leave a comment if you'd like with your thoughts. In the next video, we'll be covering the rest of the episode along with some trivia.